Okay, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be dealing with anger. And we'll get to the scriptures just now. But I want to say something first of all. So I have to talk about, because the area that I'm drawing from is the Sermon on the Mount, what is commonly known as the Sermon on the Mount in largely Matthew chapter 5. But I want to say this first of all. I have to talk about what the Sermon on the Mount is really referring to, and largely because I have to get context. It's not just about picking out what Jesus says about anger. It's about why he says that in that particular context in relation to everything else in the Sermon on the Mount. So the Sermon on the Mount is about the rightness of the kingdom heart. Remember, Jesus doesn't deal with stuff that we do. He deals with the heart, always. And we can miss that because we're expected to do things, a lot of things in life, but no one really focuses on our character, our hearts. And I do want to say this, even before I start on that. We've got to think of Jesus as a very intelligent man. I can't emphasize this enough. Most people think that Jesus is a kind of a fool. And they look at his teachings, they think he's an idiot. And in fact, often you'd find Christians that look at the Sermon on the Mount, for example, and say, well, I can't live into that. No, you can't live into that if you don't have that kind of mindset and heart set that you want the Lord to change, shape your heart, your character. That's the big thing. So Jesus is very intelligent. I've always seen him that way. He gives very intelligent answers to fundamental life issues. He's smart. He's intelligent. He's a bright guy. He knows what he's talking about. So he has a very deliberate order in the Sermon on the Mount. Now, I'm going to put myself out there. Most theologians, and I'm an amateur, so I don't classify him as a theologian at all. Most theologians say that the Sermon on the Mount, the teachings in the Sermon on the Mount are a gathering of Jesus' different teachings put together under one long passage. No, I can't agree with that. Jesus, as I say, is a smart man. He's an intelligent man. He deals with the Sermon on the Mount as one teaching. He went up onto a small hill and he faced the crowd, not just his disciples, and he taught them about character. So I have to emphasize that. So the first thing he deals with is anger. Why does he start with anger? Because anger is the most fundamental problem in human life, in human relationships. It is the most fundamental problem. So we have to start there. So I do want to say, Jesus isn't writing a theory. No. He's founding a community of redemption. That's us. So he's doing that. There's no doubt about it. He's conquered, he's conquering, and he's still conquering. The fact of the matter is that he's dealing with a community of redemption. So his project is to change people. And that's the way we have to see Jesus, is to change people and not just to gather us together in church. In fact, I don't think that Jesus primarily came to start churches. Anyway, we'll get there. So a theory, if we think that Jesus is dealing with theories, well, a theory isn't going to help someone who's flailing around in life, trying to deal with his depression and anger, and then not maybe even self-medicating, or just letting it rip and arbitrarily destroying the people around him, his family, and maybe even people at work. It's not helping. A theory doesn't help that kind of person and in that kind of situation. He's dealing with violent emotions. So, yes, primarily violent emotions which come from people's hearts. So, what I want to say about the Sermon on the Mount then, the sermon, it's a concise statement, a summary statement of directions on how to live the really good life in God's present kingdom. Now, so we can be in the ebb and flow of the kingdom. The kingdom, as I've mentioned before, I may not have, is not a place. It's the move of God. It's the power of God on the move. If we don't know what God is doing and we can't join him in it, we're not in the kingdom. That's what he's talking about. So he ends up with a statement that says, all who hear and do what I say will have a life that can stand up to everything, a life for eternity. Matthew chapter 7. So let me just summarize the sermon this way. He deals with, as far as I can discern, he deals with two major questions that human beings have always faced and always wanted to answer. Two major questions. First, what life is the good life? We all look for the good life. So you have the prosperity doctrine. That is not the good life. That's not what Jesus is talking about at all. So what is genuinely in my best interest? That's the first question he asks. And intellectuals have asked these questions since day one. To him, to Jesus, life in the life of God is the good life? He answers that in the Beatitudes, which I'm not going to touch on tonight. The second question is the one we're going to deal with. Who is a truly good person? Who's a truly good person? So, obviously, we have that kind of question which is fundamental to our life as well. We want to be good people, and I'll come back to that just now. He deals with that question in the last section of the Sermon on the Mount, from chapter 5, verse 20 to chapter 7, verse 27. So his teachings are largely in response to these questions, and he answers them brilliantly. So when Jesus comes then to deal with evil and goodness, he then goes straight to the heart of human beings, straight to the guts of human existence. So he deals with anger, rage, contempt, hatred, obsessive lust, divorce, verbal manipulation, revenge, slapping, suing, cursing, coercing people, manipulating people, begging, etc., etc. So we have to focus on this kind of issue if we really want to deal with the real issues in Christian life and how he wants to change us. So his aim then is to really to enable people to be good and not just talk about it or not just do things. That's his aim, to help people to be good. So I know this about people, and if you want to check me on this, go to Romans chapter 7. People really want to do good, but we are very ready to do evil. So there was a little girl who was asked in Sunday school, what is a lie? And she said, a lie is an abomination to God and an ever-present help in a time of trouble. Spot on. So we're going to deal with who a truly good person is. And once again, I must emphasize, it doesn't deal with acts and projects. So you can have, for example, at university, and I can talk about a particular student and I don't want to waste time on giving too many examples, because there's a lot of material to get through, but there was this particular student at Harvard University. He was in the ethics class. Now, they teach ethics. I've never understood how universities can teach ethics when they don't have absolute truth. So your ethic is your ethic, and my ethic is my ethic, etc. So he was the top student in the class of ethics. And yet, there was a girl who was in class with him, the ethics class, and she used to clean the dorms because she didn't have enough money to get through Harvard. To make money, she used to clean the residences. And then she would make money and she would pay the university so she could get through. She was in the class with this guy. One day she went to the professor and said, this man constantly harasses me sexually, but he's a top guy in your class. How can this be? How can you teach somebody ethics and yet he's totally unethical in life? Because you're separating what you do from who you are. And as I said, if you don't have absolute truth, which Jesus gives us, you're lost. Because people say, my good is my good and your good is your good. So that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to, well, he does it. So it doesn't consist of acts and projects. He's teaching us about the heart. And these are conditions in which we exist, and we have to deal with them. Anger is one in particular point. So in Matthew 5, 20 to 48, we find exactly what fulfillment of the law means in daily life. So Jesus has spoken earlier about fulfilling the law, and in that section of Matthew 5, 20 to 48, he talks about what it means to fulfill the law. Us. We fulfill the law. We should. We should be living out of the law. Once a teacher, one of my mentors a long time ago, a theologian, said, if you are living according to the law, the Old Testament law, you're like a Boeing trying to fly underground. And I've never forgotten that. Anyway, so yes, he's teaching us what it means to fulfill the law in daily life. So there's a sequence of contrasts that he makes. He looks what a good person in those days would do, like the Pharisees. So for example, he'd say, well, they were told don't kill. And then he goes to a picture of the kingdom heart, and he makes these contrasts. The law, you have heard it was said, that's the law. And I'm telling you, this is what I tell you. He makes these contrasts all the time. So all I want to say before I get on to anger is that actions don't emerge from nothing. Actions emerge from the heart. When Jesus talks about out of the heart is the core of who we are. So you can say whatever you like. You can, as I said last week, you can put on a brave front in church and in home group and even in the workplace, but eventually you will leak. Who you are will come out. It will emerge, especially if you're an angry person. So, to sum up, what Jesus would say is this. If I say to you in the law, don't murder, and the person doesn't murder, that doesn't mean he doesn't want to murder. So Jesus is saying it's not that you don't want to sin. It means that it's not that you don't sin. It means that you don't want to sin. It comes from the heart. I can still say, I didn't murder him. I didn't commit adultery. I didn't lust after a woman, but in your heart you might still do those things. And Jesus is saying, well, if it's in your heart, you've done it. So actions come from the heart. It's the inner life of soul that we aim to transform. And then naturally behavior flows from, or should flow from that. So then Jesus contrasts the heart with law. Okay, so now I'm going to get to the importance of anger. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk around anger. And I've already run off at the mouth about the kingdom and the Sermon on the Mount. So I'm going to talk around anger and anger issues in relation to what Jesus has taught. But I'm going to start from Matthew chapter 5, 21 to 22. And I'm reading from the BSB. It's not the NIV, but it's quite similar. So from verse 21, I'm going to read, "You have heard that it was said to the ancients, 'Do not murder,' and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to his brother, 'Raca,' will be subject to the Sanhedrin. But anyone who says, 'You fool,' will be subject to the fire of hell." So once again, it's very important that we actually understand what Jesus is saying there. But I want to get to the substance of Jesus' teaching in life. So the first illustration of the kingdom rightness is drawn from where we're unhappy with someone, a brother or sister, and then we allow ourselves to treat them with anger and contempt, because he deals with anger first, then he deals with contempt, and then he deals with filthy language and contempt. And I'll come back to that just now. So you treat somebody with anger, so what? What's the big deal? Well, let me not run ahead of myself. I'm talking about anger, and then I'm talking about contempt. But anger and contempt are usually hand in hand. So when you are angry and you think of the other person, think carefully of what you're thinking of them. And think carefully of what your anger is doing to them. We don't often stop at that point and say, okay, why am I angry, and what am I doing to this person in my anger? And what do I associate with this person when I'm angry? Why can I freely deliver my anger in such a way that it affects this person? Those are the questions we have to ask ourselves. So anger and contempt, very close brothers. Work alongside. Usually you find the one with the other. It's very seldom that you find just anger and just contempt. They're very close together. So it's elimination of anger and contempt that he presents as the first fundamental step toward rightness of the kingdom heart. And I'm talking, as I say, rightness of the kingdom heart. So first of all, he points out the moral inadequacy of the commandment not to kill. You've heard it long ago that they said, do not kill. Now he said that's morally inadequate. You're saying it's pointless, as I pointed out earlier. And then he uses exactly the same phrase when he says, I tell you, you should not be angry with your brother or sister. But he uses that same phrase, shall stand condemned before the law. So he's applying the same result as was applied to the law. So we can look carefully at what anger is and say, well, why? Ask the question, why should we look at this? Why is there such a harsh statement about this? Because Jesus is really making a really harsh statement. Who isn't angry? We all carry a load of anger with us because we're human beings. Get out onto the road. You see angry people. And we live in the world which is driven by anger. So if we look carefully at anger, we'll see why it is that this statement, this very strong statement, is actually justified. So anger in its own right, in itself, just anger, is an injury to others. Straight away. If someone's angry with you, you feel it. There are people who pretend that they are not affected by anger, but they lie. So, for example, I don't think I can find anybody who likes to be hooted at or doesn't mind being hooted at. You get on the road and someone hoots. If I can put that into words, it's something like this: you idiot, get out of my way. Or you fool, what do you think you're doing? But that's a tame version on the roads today. That's probably a Christian driving to Sunday church meeting. But yeah, that's tame. So when I face anger, I'm already wounded. If I'm really, really honest about it, I'm wounded. So your anger would probably enough, and we know it, to stop me or make me change course. But it's certainly going to evoke anger. It probably, let me not say certainly, it probably will evoke anger in return. So anger evokes anger. But once again, it depends on the heart. The issue is it's crossing my will. Something's crossing my will. So anger in itself is no sin. I mean, it's better to be avoided, though. I know, look, the Lord gives us emotions, and emotions are a good thing. And anger sometimes tells us just what we're feeling is wrong. But I think it should be avoided where possible. It's not a sin, but it should be avoided. I mean, headaches are not sinful, but who can do with them? It's a similar kind of analogy. So it should perform a vital function. But anger that is a reality among us is much more than just anger. It's usually rage. It turns into rage. So sometimes people have situations in which they can handle things or should believe they should handle things in anger. And it might lead to change. It might. But I would always say that anger is not the best approach. Anything you can do in anger is best done without it. So I think if you can deal with somebody in a particular way through anger, you have to have a rock-solid Christian character to be able to handle such a situation. And I don't think there are many who have rock-solid Christian characters, even though some might pretend to. So it includes a will to harm people. There's a degree of malice that is included in every degree of anger. So I remember, yes, and I am talking from a very personal perspective here. I've dealt with this for many years. I was a very angry man at one stage. So to deal with anger, it takes years. It takes years. It's not just not being angry, because you can not be angry in a given situation and still find that inside you're angry. So I was speaking to someone, but I didn't hit people. Well, not when I was older. But I would deal with people with my tongue. So I was really lambasting this woman on a particular occasion. And then she stopped. She said, "Okay, so are you going to hit me now?" You know, she had a very telling point there, because that's what anger does. It makes you feel that you've actually hit me anyway, if we're honest about it. So just by looking or refusing to look or raising voice or refusing to speak at all, you can make your point known through anger. So yeah, we learn different ways of being anger. Introverts learn how gentle to be with anger, but it's still anger. But there's another involvement of the will in anger that makes it so deadly, and why Jesus discusses it in this way. We can, and we usually do, choose to be angry. We choose to be angry. I have a choice at a given point, but once again, it goes to the heart. You can still stop yourself in the process of learning how not to be an angry person. It's a very difficult thing. It kind of becomes like addiction. But if you become an angry person, you carry around with you a supply of anger that is likely to come out at any given situation, in any frustration, even inanimate objects. You get angry. You bump into a door. It's the door's fault. Why is this door here? So yeah, it's, as I said earlier, most people carry around a load of anger, but boy, if you become an angry person, which I would say, whatever you can do to avoid that, avoid it. But it's very, very destructive. You destroy yourself and you destroy people around you. And yes, you can also say, and I know this, why was I angry and why did I allow my anger to flow from me? Well, I wasn't a Christian, and I actually thought it was a great thing. I thought it was good. I achieved what I wanted to achieve. This person is getting in my way. This person is preventing me from doing what I want to do. Out comes the tongue. So my students knew it. But when I became a Christian, I realized this is a really bad thing. So yeah, maybe people's anger comes from this quiet desperation as a result of the frustrations of life. Maybe, and probably yes. Well, one of the reasons why anger is so dangerous, that it's always, this is a point about anger. Whenever you encounter anger, the person who's angry, you'll find that he or she believes it's perfectly righteous in the moment. They feel it's right. They feel, no, this is just. I feel that I'm angry at this thing, and I will justify it. So in the moment, they feel perfectly justified in their anger. That's a dangerous thing. So they also then feel that it justifies what they do in anger. And anger, contempt, hatred, murder. That's the process that we go through. So when we feel justified in anger, and I'll get to the point that I'm making just now about this justification of anger, when we feel that, we're never critical of anger. Who do you find today in life ever criticizes anger? Very seldom do you find such a person. So all feelings that arise in anger, don't get us to ask the question, am I okay in it? Am I right in it? And Jesus would say no. But yeah, thoughts and beliefs, I'll come back to this just now, as I said, but thoughts and beliefs, if we are thinking and trying to absorb the teachings of Jesus, tend to stop us and cause us to be critical about our anger, which happened in my life. But feelings just hammer at you. They say, I want, now. And that's how human beings exist today. I want it because I want it. I don't even have to justify it. So an example is, say somebody's caught up in an affair. That person will feel completely justified in the feelings that they have. Completely. And they'll actually be angry. And I've sat in counseling situations where exactly this happens. A man sitting with his wife is having an affair, and he justifies it in front of her. You see, the problem is, we have a problem in our marriage, and it is her. And that's why, you see, because she doesn't do this and this and this, and so I go there. And what else am I supposed to do? So, yes, you feel completely justified. But if that original honeymoon phase subsides, and then the process of thinking through it, if it happens, then you'd find, okay, I can be critical of this. Many Christians get caught up in this kind of thing. Many. So we act in anger before we think. And that's where our mean Christians come from. We have professing Christians who don't come to terms with anger, don't know how. So when things happen that are contrary to their will, they attack others, they withdraw from others, they're not on top of their feelings and emotions. So I could ask the question, well, why would anyone embrace anger and indulge in it? Why? I mean, people are killed by anger. Road rage kills people. People kill people on the road just because someone has cut them off. They get out and they shoot them. And then people die from secondhand anger as well. So the answering to this question is actually very important if we're to understand the ways of the human heart. So anger indulged always has an element of self-righteousness and vanity, which is what I said just now. In other words, it involves the wounded ego. The ego is an issue to us. You find a person who's embraced anger, and you'll find a person who has a wounded ego. And I know this. My ego was in the way all the time. And yes, that is blown out of proportion. So there's this low burning resentment that can, for some people, angry people, becomes like a holy crusade to inflict harm on many. A little while ago, I don't know whether you remember, in the United States, there was this trans person who went to a Christian school and started shooting kids. You see, there's a wounded ego, not recognized, and so carries out anger. So yeah, anger embraced is destructive to human personality and life. So I'm emphasizing the point, and I'm re-emphasizing. But yeah, when it's allowed to govern our actions, then it becomes evil. So in South Africa, for example, we have 27,000 murders every year, approximately. And I've asked the question. In fact, I asked the question at Pulse 2 days ago. I said, how does a man rape a baby? Now, I know that's a rhetorical question. I know how. I know how there is so much rape and abuse of women in this country. One of the worst in the world, if not the worst in the world. It comes from the rage that sits in the hearts of human beings, that sits in the hearts of men. In fact, there was a man once in Johannesburg he was so torn by this young girl who was raped so badly, and they found her in the bush in a terrible scenario. Even the police who discovered her had to have psychological counseling. And he took it so to heart that he cried out to the Lord. And he went around the country and he said there should be a men's repentance movement. And he said, I'm going to repent, and I want men to repent with me on behalf of other men in this country. Just like Daniel said, Lord, we have sinned against you. And then he put on sackcloth and ashes like the old prophets did, and he gathered a group of men and he marched from Johannesburg into Soweto, where they found this woman, and then they went to the parents. You see, he's saying, I am prepared to gather men as best I can because of this terrible scenario in human hearts in South Africa, and I'm prepared to repent on behalf of. Of course, you can't necessarily, but you're doing it prophetically and saying, Lord, please, can you intervene somehow in the scenario? So yes, anger and contempt are scourges of the earth. If you mix that with greed and sexual lust, which Jesus talks about, they form this poisonous brew in which we find ourselves today, in human existence. That's where human existence almost, it's a swamp. Now, I just want to say something else before I get back to Matthew 5. Influential people today will tell us that we must be angry. It's necessary to be angry, to oppose evil, to oppose wrong, to oppose social evil. So I know of a Christian couple who are counseled how to discipline their children, and they were told, don't discipline your child in anger. And the father's response was, what? Do you expect me to discipline my child in cold blood? You know why? Because he believed, you see, he's mixing up righteousness with anger. He believed that the tone you use is very important to emphasize the point. So your child must know that they've done wrong and you're angry about it. But he's confusing the issues. The child focuses more on the anger than the issues involved. So tone, yes, tone. Let me put it to you this way. If you say the most wonderful things to a dog, but you use a very angry tone, that dog is going to whimper off. But if you say lovely things to a dog, but you have this the other way around. If you say very bad things to a dog, but you have a loving tone, it'll lick your hand and wag its tail. So the tone is irrelevant to the issue. So yeah, it's that's the belief. Today we have to be angry, otherwise you cannot emphasize the point. So social commentators teach that rage is essential in the struggle for justice. Now you come across that often. So if you don't act with anger today, there are people who think that you don't actually have much to say. You have to have an angry tone behind it, and then people will listen. Okay, but it's not correct. I know that myself. I've always said if you have an opinion, have an opinion with some passion, but not necessarily anger. Okay, people will say, for example, that God gets angry. People say Jesus got angry, so it justifies, and we can have righteous anger. Well, you know what? My answer to that is this. God gets angry for sure. I can trust his character. He can handle it. When Jesus got angry and went into the temple, I can trust what he's doing. I wouldn't trust myself with that. So you can trust his character. He knows how to handle it. He knows how to handle it very, very well. So yeah, there's nothing that can be done in anger that cannot be done better without it. So Jesus deliberately starts with anger then. So I want to tell you why. I'm taking some time, but please bear with me. Jesus starts with anger right at the start of the Sermon on the Mount. Why? Well, you can go to any other area of the sermon. Say, for example, verse 41. And that statement is, whoever forces you to go to a mile, then go with him 2. Well, we might today say, no, that's not such a big deal. Well, I will say you will not do well with that unless you've dealt with anger first. Now, the context, once again, is shocking in terms of what Jesus was saying in his day. So he was speaking to Jewish people, and Jewish people were forced by Roman law to walk a mile carrying a piece of baggage or whatever for a Roman soldier or whatever for a mile. And of course they were angry about that. Of course they were angry about it. So you're forced by a Roman soldier to carry a load for 1 mile, and Jesus saying, no, carry it 2 miles. Carry it 2 miles. So it's unbelievably radical what Jesus said. I'll tell you why. Because a Roman, to the Jews, was an uncircumcised pig. And if a Jew had to go into a Roman household, or deal with the Roman at any close quarters, then he was spiritually unclean. And that Jew then couldn't go to participate in religious rituals or join certain company. So that was radical. What Jesus was saying was absolutely radical. The zealots, if they had an opportunity to walk with a mile with the Roman, would take any opportunity they could to kill them. So it's in the eyes of Jesus, though, this is what he was saying. You guys are disrespecting Romans. What? The Romans? Give me a break here. But he's saying you're not going to be able to deal with that if you don't deal with your anger issues first. To them, they were quite justified to disrespect Romans. In fact, to hate them, to kill them. So, for example, another example is you cannot, an angry person will not be able to turn the other cheek if smacked in the face. There's no chance. You have to deal with your anger first, then you can turn the other cheek. I might be able to turn the other cheek and be angry inside, but I'm still angry, and that's the point that Jesus is making. So I'm making this point. These statements, these teachings of Jesus are made in a progressive way. So the first sets of issues that he deals with and talks about are anger and contempt. So Matthew 5:21 to 22. Let me come back to that. He's saying this: when you are angry with someone, you have exactly the same kind of guilt as someone who murders. Now that, for us, that's radical. Even today, that's radical. That's why people say, I can't live into Jesus' teachings. It's too radical. I mean, I've heard someone saying the Beatitudes, and I have a different view of the Beatitudes. I don't think it's holding up to this perfect picture of what a Christian should be. And someone said, I can't live into that. People can look at what Jesus says here. Barack Obama said, it's impossible for any human being to live into that. Yes, for you. But if you allow Jesus to mold you, to have the right character, the kingdom character, this is just second nature. The left hand, not knowing what the right hand is doing, is saying, when I do something, I don't harbor on it and think, I'm doing such a good thing. And I remember this good thing I'm doing. When someone next week says to you, wow, you did such a wonderful thing there, you say, what thing did I do? Because you do it naturally. That's the character that Jesus is pointing at all the time. The left hand not knowing what the right hand, in intellectual ways, it's impossible. My left hand is always going to know what the right hand's doing. But in terms of the metaphor that Jesus is drawing, he's saying the kingdom heart doesn't focus on those things. Maybe one day when he gets to heaven, Jesus will say to him, well, that's fantastic. And he'll say, well, what did I do? When we go to heaven one day, if I march up to Jesus one day after my death and I say, Lord Jesus, did you see what I achieved in life? You know, my reputation. I became a professor. I was so wonderful. I was so great in research. Do you see how many awards I got in research? He'll say, what reputation are you talking about? What is that now? It's not the issue. The only thing you can take to Jesus Christ one day is who you are. That's it. Nothing else. The deeds that you do have to come from who you are. Otherwise, you can do the most wonderful things, and there are atheists who do the most incredible things on the planet. That's not the point. So, then he comes to the contempt side. Raka is an Aramaic term. It's uncertain in its origins, but it kind of means when I clear my throat to spit, the noise you make, you know. I won't try that, but you know what I mean. You can practice it at home. But you see the contempt in that when people, they spit. So that's worse than being angry. So Jesus is saying progressively, if you say raka to your brother, well, that's worse than being angry. And then if you call someone a fool, well, that's even worse. All of these expressions are meant to harm people. Gehenna, that he uses actually in the original text, Gehenna is the word that he uses there. Gehenna is not Hades, it's not hell. Gehenna is a burning dump heap of garbage outside the city walls. He says there's a burning involved. You will burn. You'll burn within. By the way, when you call someone raka, it's like saying today, it's like calling someone a twerp or an idiot or a nerd. And when you call someone a fool, today if someone says you fool, well, it's bad enough, you know, but today it's much harsher. It's more like the F word that is used, you effing idiot, or you effing idiot. So yeah, but that's where he's going. He's saying it's terrible what it does to human beings because we're made in God's image. So he's putting an incredibly heavy weight on stepping out of anger. So why do we have so many angry people? Why do we have so many angry Christians? Because they've never been taught how to deal with anger. And we can step out of anger. So anger deals with the will. As I said earlier, we make a choice. We decide. And that's where you have to begin. It also it makes a presupposition in terms of who we are as Christians. The presupposition is, in other words, it's saying to us, you have done something as a Christian, as someone who's born again. You have surrendered your will to God. That means I've accepted the fact that I don't have my way anymore. So the other person who's parked in your place, in your parking bay, set aside, reserved for you, now what? So do you swear and carry on and say, I'm going to go get this guy, and then you go and you holler at the guy, you shout at the guy, and then he shouts back at you and nothing's resolved? Or do you go down a block and a half down the way and find another parking bay, and then while you're doing it, praise God? So you have to have compassion on the person. It doesn't mean that you don't speak about it. It doesn't mean that you don't speak to them about it. You face that. But it's necessary in order to correct the situation. It just means you don't do it in anger and contempt. So surrendering the will to God means a pervasive change in all phases of our lives. The meaning of the cross in spiritual growth and redemption is precisely what you're talking about here. So Jesus didn't die on the cross so we would not have to die on the cross. Like some people believe that what Jesus died on the cross for, so we could have a good life. Well, the good life is very different, as I said much earlier, in terms of what Jesus is teaching. He died on the cross so that we can die on the cross. And Lord, I don't want to suffer, but Paul says that he's crucified with Christ. I've given up my life to God. I've laid it down. So if I have my life full of murmurings and complaints and accusing even inanimate objects of being in the way and people about why you're such fools, you idiot. So then it doesn't mean I'm a terrible person or a weak and an infirm creature. It just means because I lack the first principle of Christianity, a right belief in God. That's where Jesus is going. He's talking about being thankful to God in everything. The will and being thankful. So thankfulness is an expression, an acknowledgement of the goodness of God towards you. You either believe that or you don't. Or you half believe it. So complaining, moaning, being angry, shouting at people, it's actually an accusation of God's want of goodness toward you. That's what you believe in your heart. You believe that God is not being good toward you. And when I struggle, I'm asking, why am I struggling? Why am I suffering? Why do I have this pain? Because I believe actually that God is not good. Otherwise, when James says, consider it pure joy, when you fall into trials and tribulations of all kinds, he's saying, it's not that you're expected to have joy in it, although the result of the kingdom character means you are in joy. He's saying, look to the outcome and what the Lord is using this to transform you into and allow him to do it. That's what you're having joy in. Entering God's rest, by the way, means that the Lord has finally taken oath on you. And he's saying, I see. And entering into God's rest means you have peace that surpasses all understanding. You have the joy. You are thankful to God all the time. But the issue that I'm dealing with now is thankfulness. Who's the greatest Christian in the world? Not the one who prays the most, not the one who fasts the most, not the one who gives the most, not the one who is most well known, is the most fantastic theologian on the planet, the most fantastic teacher, not any of that. It's the person who always thanks God in all things. That's why I say, can you walk away from someone who's parked in your bay and be thankful to the Lord? Thank you, Lord, that he's parked in my bay. I can go and find another parking bay. So yeah, it's about being thankful to God, and who wills everything that God wills, who receives everything as an instance of God's goodness, and then has a heart always ready to praise God for it. So stepping out of anger then means that we are willing to submit our will to God. Denying yourself, that's what denying yourself is. It means, Lord, I say no to mine, what Jesus did in Gethsemane. You know, Jesus went through great suffering, but he was a very joyful man. Great suffering. The Passion of the Christ, that movie, did not show enough of his suffering. People said, no, it's too much blood, too much blood, too much blood. It's irrelevant, the suffering that he went through. So if our Lord and God was prepared to go through that for us, we can't expect that he's just going to give us a joyful life. Well, once again, I take a step back. Not happiness in the way we understand, but joy. Yes, he gives us that joy. And Paul said, I'm content in all things. And boy, Paul went through some suffering. The point of the matter is the only things that Jesus is focusing on is God's enormous, unbelievable redemptive plan and our character, so that we can be part of that. That's what he focuses on. That's what he teaches constantly. And yes, we can be his disciples, and his disciples who he called mini-faiths. He joked with them all the time, you mini-faiths. So he's saying to them, you guys haven't got it yet. You haven't got it. You haven't got it. You haven't got it. But they were getting it. They were getting there. So yes, contempt then is greater evil than anger. So it's deserving of greater condemnation. So whoever says raka to a brother stands condemned before the Sanhedrin, the highest court in the land. So yes, it's very important that we understand contempt. Anger is focused on you. I see you, I recognize you as having done something against me, and I'm going to nail you. Contempt, on the other hand, says, I don't even recognize you. You're irrelevant to me. I can ignore you. If anger and contempt join together, then I swear at you. So I let rip, and I'm just showing you then that you're irrelevant to me. In fact, you're lower than a dog or something I tramp on my lawn after my dog has been there. That's contempt. That's how we see people when we see contempt for what it is. And Jesus says that's a really terrible thing. So usually, you find this everywhere. You see it in the schoolyard, you see it at a party, you see it at home sometimes, you even see it in church sometimes. Everyone lives in this. We don't like to be excluded. We are social beings. We want to be included socially. And when people hold us in contempt, they exclude us. It happens in the schoolyard, remember? And you're excluded. It's a wound. We want to be included. And everybody today, even though they might say no, they live in terror of it. So you noticed something recently, and I found this, and I find it absolutely, I shouldn't find it shocking, but I do. I find that filthy language is included naturally in language today. So if you watch a movie, it just flows, or a series on something, it just flows from people's mouths. It's natural to them because they don't find anything wrong with it. So it's become, and especially amongst young people. So filthy language and name-calling is an expression of contempt. And people just don't find anything wrong with it. So we have this contempt and anger floating out in society. I remember some time back, I watched some news in the United Kingdom, and there you had these 12 and 14-year-old children who kill people. Kids, man, young kids. And they look like they have no, well, apparently it was reported that they have absolutely no feeling whatsoever. But if you study them carefully, you'll see they have contempt. If anyone disses them, that's what gang members, boy, you don't diss a gang member because then you die. It's their contempt, their anger becoming rage at being dissed, and so they kill. It's their language for being contemptuous. So yes, I don't want to berate the point so much other than to say it can hurt so badly and destroy so deeply that murder for some people would almost be a mercy. In fact, this is the kind of thing that drives some people to suicide. Well, I cannot. Relationships and relationships that go wrong. This is the consequence. So I want to end off with this, saying this. It's not only the negative. Jesus also deals with the positive side. He makes a contrast immediately after that. I'm going to read from verse 23 to 26 in Matthew chapter 5. So if you're offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar. First go and be reconciled to your brother. Then come and offer your gift. Reconcile quickly with your adversary while you are still on the way to court. Otherwise, he may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny. So here we have the contrast. This is the positive side to anger and contempt. So what does this mean then? He's still talking about anger and contempt. What Jesus is now doing is contrasting the right attitude with the wrong attitude. He gives us a teaching on what a person who has the right attitude will do in that situation. So he's going to the positive now. He's saying, you see, the contrast is that person who will say, I can't even go to church. I must go and sit right. If it suddenly occurs to me, there's something wrong between my relationship with so-and-so and so-and-so, or something happened and I forgot about it. So that person will then go and sort it out. So they put aside this ritual. And once again, Jesus is looking at a situation and he's saying something unbelievably radical in that context. So Jesus is taking a look then at this situation. There's this huge temptation for us today. It still exists today, amongst us Christians especially. We overlook the moral dimension completely in favor of the ritual dimension. The ritual dimension is what we do. And we do all these magnificent things, but our hearts are all wrong. Not always, I'm just saying generally that is the case because it's easier. So there's always this tendency in religious institutions to glorify those processes to such an extent that people end up substituting ritual behavior for moral rightness and then don't understand why it's wrong. So Jesus is countering that. He's suggesting this outrageous thing in those days. You interrupt your offering at the temple for some trivial thing like going make right with your brother or sister. That's trivial. I mean, going to the temple and offering a sacrifice is fundamentally important. So he's doing that in those days. He's doing that to shock them. Once again, I've always said, there's a word that I use in relation to the Lord, and I think Chris has also used it some time back. God is scandalous. Jesus scandalized people. In those days, they were, I can't believe what he's saying. I think that's why they got angry with him. So he's showing it's not just that you don't kill your brother, you don't want to kill him. I want to really love him. And remember, the prophets always had this problem with people making sacrifices, holding to days, and thinking that they were just wonderful because they did that. And they presented themselves that way. Inside, they were morally debauched. And that's why Jesus said, guys, you're like tombs, wonderfully whitewashed on the outside, but inside you're fraught. So they're substituting ritual behavior for genuine goodness and rightness. So Jesus is saying, look, you stop it. In those days, you never, ever broke your sacrifice at the temple. You never did. Nothing ever stopped that unless it was another ritual. So for Jesus to say, you don't do that, because it becomes irrelevant. He's saying, what you're doing there is irrelevant in God's eyes. First of all, go and do what is important to the Lord. And they were like, you. So even when Jesus spoke about the prodigal father, the prodigal son, but it's actually the prodigal father, they were scandalized in those days, in the context of those days, that a father would do that when a son has said he's dead. It was scandalous. They would say, never. Bring me my shambok. So yes, he's making these outrageous comments to these people. But he takes another case. He says, make friends quickly with your opponent who's taking you to court. Engaged in a lawsuit. Rather make friends with that person. And that illustrates in the genuine heart of the kingdom person. It's so far from what, I don't know if you've ever been to court, but I certainly have. You don't find friendly people there. You don't. There are angry people there. And that anger comes out. So, there are people, though, now that I'm digressing a little bit, but you'll find that there are Christians who say you should never go to law with a fellow Christian. There was a businessman who said, well, I don't conduct business with Christians because if things go wrong in their dealings, I can't take them to law. So he's read this passage and he said, I can't take fellow Christians to law. That's not what Jesus is saying at all. He's not saying don't go to law. He's saying this is how you should go to law if you do. Try to avoid it. Be friendly with the person who's taking you. Even goes further a little bit later on. He says, well, if they take your shirt, give them your jacket as well. Once again, in those days, it was like you. Today, it's even. So the person wins the case. Jesus teaches that. If someone sues you, takes your overcoat, be friendly with them. Ask them whether they actually need your jacket as well. And if you've got a jacket, give it to them. So you have to see whether if we get that far, what will it do to everything else? Let me quickly end with this. If you take anger and contempt out of pornography, how much pornography do you think we'd have? And believe me, the church is shot full of guys who are caught up in pornography. Not even only men today, women as well. But if you take anger and contempt out of pornography, how much pornography do you have left? Well, I'd be willing to say there will be none left. Jesus understands the structure of the immoral life. So when he goes for it, he just pulls the foundations out from under it. If people are not contemptible of others, there would be no pornography. In pornography, there's contempt and anger. If I am not unhappy with my wife, I'm not going to go to pornography. If I don't have anger and contempt for people, I'm not going to go to pornography. If you have anger and contempt in your heart, and you see people in a certain way, especially if you're angry with your wife, or your wife or your husband for that matter doesn't satisfy you, that's where you go, because you have anger and contempt. So there are people, these are people who are willing to degrade others and see others degraded. That's what pornography is about. It's an expression of anger and contempt. And often they're religious people, even religious leaders, because this is precisely what Jesus is talking about. He knew that the people he was referring to were Pharisees and scribes, the religious people. They would commit adultery if they had the opportunity. They weren't fearful of what would happen, because nothing would happen. But they were contemptuous. You could see that just by reading what Jesus says about them. But if they weren't angry with their wives, if they weren't unsatisfied with their wives, then they would not be looking for something elsewhere. So he takes up this topic of adultery. He goes straight to the heart. He says, anyone who looks at a woman to lust, by the way, if you read your version there and it says, and lusts, or commits adultery, or looks to a woman lustfully, scratch it out, it's wrong. Not and lust, or lustfully, which is and, in order to. So he's saying there are people men who will look at a woman in order to lust. They already have it in them because of anger and contempt. And they will, in their minds, undress that woman while they're looking at them. Lusting is not just looking at a woman. Okay. There's a lot that I could say. So you can check the Greek on this. And I'll finish with this. I know I've taken a long time. Thanks for bearing with me. But we've got to distinguish from these three things. Thought of sin. Thought of sin is not sin. Inclination to sin, that's temptation, that's not sin. And readiness to sin. What Jesus is talking about is what is in the heart, that's readiness to sin. Whether it's anger or adultery or lust or whatever. So we'll be dealing with the third, readiness to sin. And I'll even go so far as to say this. If I won't say it, because it's quite a controversial thing in the sense of people don't really understand the morality that Jesus is getting to. So let me not say that. I'll double think that. I'll stop. But yes, we're not talking about a thought of sin. We're not talking about inclination to sin. And so the inclination to sin, in other words, temptation, I find I'm tempted to something, is not sin. How you deal with it, though, if I go the third step to actually be ready and do sin, if I have readiness in my heart and therefore do it in my heart even, that's what we're talking about here. Okay, I'm taking a lot of your time this evening. Thanks for bearing with me. What I've done is I've put 2 questions up to help us. Are there 3? Okay, 3 questions. They are just to help discussion, but please discuss anything you like to discuss. When I send the summary notes out, I have much more in-depth questions because they're meant to probe and they're meant to help us to spend time with the Lord and probe our own hearts and get us beyond the issue of just denying and leaving, ignoring, etc. So, if you want to look at those questions, you want to discuss them, great. If you want to have any other discussion or thoughts that have come up, great as well.